Hello again, and welcome to the Pastor Study. I'm the pastor, Dave Thomas, lead pastor of Cross of Christ Lutheran Church in beautiful Bellevue, Washington. We're here in my study, and this is the study for the fifth Sunday after the Epiphany. This is February 7th, 2021. It's also the first pastor study. We've been together for a while. I took some time off in January, and it's good to be back here with you in my study and to be back in the study of God's Word together. So let's just jump right in. This is the first lesson from Isaiah 40, 21 to 31. In this section of Isaiah, which starts here at chapter 40, it's a transitional point in the book. It's a break from the first 39 chapters. They were mostly filled with warnings, God pointing out the people's sin and the sins of their leaders, and warning them about what was to come. The exile, the fall of Jerusalem, and the taking of the exiles. And now, as that has happened, God speaks a new word. It's a word of comfort and of hope. And God is well positioned to make and to keep such promises of better days ahead. He is King of all days and the creator of all things. And that's kind of the theme of this part of Isaiah, beginning here in 40. And particularly in this section, the prophet finds it hard to believe, can barely fathom that anyone could not believe in God. Just look around. Above you, under you, all around you, Isaiah says. The evidence of God's glory is everywhere. So let's hear this lesson and spend some time studying together. And it begins, have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? Here, Isaiah uses a lot of have not rhetorical questions. The answer is rhetorically implied, or is implied to these rhetorical questions. Of course you have. These are things that people have been told, the people of God. Isaiah speaking to the Jewish people in exile here. And they have heard it, and from their beginnings, but also from the beginning of the stories, from the foundation of the earth. Not only that, but just look around, and creation itself confirms this. Remember, he's addressing people of faith, not just a general audience. Although much later, the Apostle Paul will make pretty much the same claim to non-Jewish Greek scholars, that creation itself is ample evidence to believe in one creator God. So back to our reading. It is he, that is, it is God, it is Yahweh, who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. Now, that was a common analogy in the Bible to compare something that is experiencing smallness comparatively to grasshoppers. Now, remember the spies sent into the promised land. They reported feeling like grasshoppers compared to the giant-sized occupants they saw there. Today, we'd probably more commonly use another small insect, the ant, to describe feeling small, but grasshoppers, that works too. It is he, Yahweh, who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. It is he who stretched out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in. He brings the princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon it and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. This is fantastic poetic language. The parallels are just as clear, if not more clear, in the original Hebrew, that what God is up to and is eternal and everlasting, and the things of the earth, even the things of princes and kings, are temporary and passing. Now in our reading, the voice shifts from God's prophet Isaiah to God himself. To whom then will you compare me? The voice of the Lord. Or who is my equal, says the Holy One. The Hebrew word here is kadosh. It means holy. We find it 27 times in Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament. Who is equal to me, says the Holy One. Now, following this divine inquiry, to whom will you compare me, Yahweh, the voice shifts back to that of the prophet. Lift up your eyes and on high and see. Who created these? That is, who created the stars and all the heavenly bodies? He who brings them out, he who brings out their host, their ranks, their number. Host is an older English word. It's translating a Hebrew word for ranks or army, and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength, mighty in power. No one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord, that is Yahweh, and my right is disregarded by my God. Have you not heard? Have you not known? Have you not heard? Returning again to this rhetorical question and carrying on with some of the most uplifting language in the Bible. This is a beautiful language. The Lord, Yahweh, when we see that, again, we'll remind ourselves the word Lord in the Old Testament and English Bibles with a capital L, a capital O, R, and D, even though the O, R, D are often smaller than the L. That is many translations replacement for the tetragrammaton, the four-letter, four-consonant naming of God, which we transliterate into English usually YHWH, and most commonly pronounce as Yahweh. So the Lord, that is Yahweh, is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. I like the direct language of the Hebrew here. The word order would be, neither faint nor weary does he grow. Unsearchable is his understanding. Back to the reading, he gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. God does not lose God's power, doesn't grow weary or faint. Not only that, but God helps, reaches out to, pulls up the powerless, the faint. And we'll see that reflected later in our other readings. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. And we have similar language in other parts of the Bible, especially the Psalms, Psalm 91 and Psalm 102. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And I actually have, I'm going to get it for me, for us, I guess, a banner. Let's see if we can see that. With a reference to that, he will lift you up on eagle's wings, from a retreat, spiritual retreat that I was on in 1995, returning to the screen here, called Curcio. Glorious for those of you who are part of that movement. All right, that's the first lesson. We've not been using a psalm during Epiphany. We will return to the Psalms in Lent. So for now, we move on to the second lesson. The New Testament lesson this week is from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 16 to 23. This is from the pen of the Apostle Paul. If I, Paul, proclaim the gospel. These three words in English translate a single specific Greek word, which I'll get to in a little bit when we look at this week's gospel, because there's a similar word, not the same word, but comparative words. So we'll just put that in the back of our minds and we'll get to that. If I, Paul, proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. So I want to share a personal reflection here. I really appreciate Paul so much for saying this. People sometimes ask me, why do you want to be a pastor? Or why do you want to be a preacher? And I always tell them, I didn't want to be a pastor, and I don't want to be a pastor. I'm not saying that I'm not humbled by my call. I'm not saying there's not a lot of joy in my calling, like these Bible studies. I love the research that goes into them. I love sharing them with you through this venue. I love sharing them in person. But being a pastor wasn't and isn't my idea. The summary of my coming to be called as a pastor goes something like this. God called, I resisted. God called, I resisted. God called, I resisted. God persisted. God insisted. God used many, many means. And finally, I gave in. And then from that point on, some 20 years ago now, more than that, 23, 4, I almost daily ask God, are you sure? Are you sure you still want me to preach your word, to guide your people, to lead your church? Because I am not worthy. I am not ideal. I am not perfect. And yet God calls, and I have learned the hard way to be obedient. The same with coming here to Seattle and to Cross of Christ. I didn't want to come here. I did not want to come here. I was just open to God's call, to anywhere in the world where God would lead me and to where God's people would call me. And so I'm grateful, blessed to be here, but I didn't pick Seattle. I didn't pick Cross of Christ. I was called here by God and by you. So I am under obligation, under a calling. And so long as that is the case, as best as I can discern, woe to me, as Paul would say, woe to me if I would even think about doing otherwise. Well, enough about me. Let's get back to Paul, who says, for if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission. So Paul learned way before me to listen to God and to be shaped by God and to be open to being used by God. And of course, Paul's first encounter as Saul, the persecutor of the church, was quite dramatic, even more dramatic than my calling, although my call story does have a lot of divine drama in it. Paul learned that one way or the other, God was going to prevail in his plan to use this unlikely herald of good news. And that applies to Paul, and that applies to me too. Paul goes on in our reading. What then is my reward? Just this, that in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave. That's a Greek word, doulos, which is a word for a common slave. Sometimes it gets translated to servant. There's other words in Greek that might be translated servant here. Straight up, no doubt, a bondage slave, doulos. I have made myself a doulos to all, so that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. Paul actually was a Jew, but he means he, with the Jews, he came to them where they were, especially in their Jewishness, to share the good news as a starting point. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I may win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win the weak. So what Paul is talking about here is making accommodations that do not violate God's law, but which allow Paul to be on the level of those to whom he is preaching and teaching and leading and setting an example. So among fellow Jews, Paul was happy to not offend, to keep kosher, as it were. But to those not under the law, to non-Jews, to Gentiles, Paul was just as happy to participate in their lifestyle so long as it did not violate God's law. He was happy to eat what was set before him, kosher or not. Last week, Paul talked about a matter of much debate in his day, eating meat sacrificed to idols. And he shared his compromise or accommodating position on that. So as we listen to this, we might think to ourselves, are we as willing to meet people where they are as Paul was and to make accommodations for others, for the sake of others? Or do we expect the others, the outsiders, to accommodate to us and to our preferences? And here I'm talking about all the non-essentials, things like worship style, or worship time, or what people wear to worship, or all those kinds of things. Paul, I think, sets a good example for us that he had a willingness to meet people where they were and to not make secondary or down the line things more important than sharing the gospel. But now, having shared my appreciation for Paul, I want to say that I would have just as soon he ended this portion of his letter right there and not written this last part, which is this. I have become all things to all people that I might by all means save some. So yes, Brother Paul, I agree and I get your point. But I have to say, I have not found myself capable of being all things to all people, especially when some want or need the exact opposite of the wants or needs of others. I don't think I can be all things to all people. And my experience as a pastor is you can't. I can't. So I had to prefer Paul not write that. But Paul's motives were clearly right as he concludes this portion of our reading. He says, I do it all for the sake of the gospel so that I may share in its blessing. So hard to knock Paul too much with those motives, but that's a pretty high calling to be all things to all people. All right, now we move on to the gospel. This is from the Gospel of Mark, first chapter, verses 29 to 39. This is a continuation of the section of Mark that we've been reading from for a while now. So we pick it up here at verse 29. As soon as they, that is Jesus and the disciples, left the synagogue, where we'll remember that Jesus had taught with authority and cast out an unclean spirit from a man he encountered there, they entered the house of Simon. This is Simon, the brother of Andrew, who Jesus will soon give a new name or a nickname. He will call Simon Peter or Petra, which means a rock. So he enters the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. So they are still in Capernaum, where Jesus had been in the synagogue. This is a fishing village on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, here's my Sea of Galilee map. It's, let's see, from your perspective, it's right over here. It's almost to the northern end on the western shore. Now, this was also the home, apparently, of Simon and Andrew and James and John, that is Capernaum. And now they're entering the actual home where Peter lived. And as they enter, we hear this. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever. It's an interesting Greek word here. It's pyresusa, and it literally means to be on fire. We get our word or our not a pronoun, our prefix pyro, like pyromaniac or pyroglyphics, from this word fire in Greek. So now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed, burning up with a fever, on fire with a fever. And they told him, Jesus, about her at once. And we might ask, if we stop here as Bible students and ask ourselves, ask of the text, why did they tell Jesus about Simon's sick mother-in-law? Well, clearly, at least I think it's clear, the expectation was that he would intervene and bring healing as he did in the synagogue. So let's see what happens. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. He raised her up. Is the intent here of the Greek word. It is to physically lift someone. And I'll be spending some more time about this, taking her hand and lifting her up, in our sermon this week. But we'll note for now that Jesus does quite a bit of this in the Gospels, taking someone by the hand and lifting them up, including Simon Peter himself, when they are together walking on the water of that same Galilean Sea, and things begin to take a disastrous turn for Peter. His faith falters and he begins to sink, and Jesus reaches out his hand and takes Peter's and he pulls him up from the waves and into the boat. So we'll hear more about that this Sunday. So he takes Simon's mother-in-law by the hand and raises her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. Now, someone made a pretty big deal about this, saying something like, well, that poor woman just got over her fever, and she's back to woman's work, serving the men. And there may be something to that, for sure. The culture then was very male-centric. Most cultures in human history have been very male-centric, including ours. Less so than it has been, but not by any means equitable among men and women, among the genders, among all people. So in many cultures, that would have been understood that that was a woman's role, to serve men. And some people have pushed back about that and said they would have rather Jesus said, you know what, you've had a hard day, just why don't you take it easy. But it's just as good a theory that she didn't grudgingly go back to her subservient role, but that she was relieved to be healed and grateful and glad to be able to take up her high position of host for these guests of her daughter and son-in-law. We'll note that the Greek word here, which we translate to serve, is the word diakonia or diakonia, which literally means to minister to. We get the word deacon, diakonia, deacon, which is a servant minister of the church, directly from this word. I think the main point Mark is trying to convey is that the woman was previously, moments ago, bedbound and burning up with a fever, and she was instantaneously and miraculously cured by Jesus, so completely healed that she was able to pop up and minister to Jesus and her other guests. So back to the reading. That evening at sunset, they brought to Jesus all who were sick or possessed with demons. And here Mark uses a very specific word that means to be demon-possessed. Not other words that are available in Greek that describe someone who is acting wildly or out of their mind or not under control, but it literally means to be possessed by demons. Because whatever we think of it, Mark and the New Testament writers and Jesus himself believed in demon possession. They testified to it. And scriptures are clear in the synagogue and in these stories that Jesus had authority to cast out such demons. Mark goes on to write, and the whole city was gathered around the door, that is, of the house there, Simon's house. And he, Jesus, cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. And he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Now that sounds weird to us, right? Why wouldn't he permit the demons to speak? And what does it have to do with knowing him? Well, it sounds weird to us on a couple of levels. That Jesus forbade the demons from speaking, and the reason was because they knew his true identity. Now, there's plenty of theories about this, but the leading one is that Jesus was not ready to have his true identity revealed. His true identity as the Son of God, the Savior of the world, the Messiah. As Jesus himself will say elsewhere, the time has not yet come. Likewise, especially in Mark, Jesus often tells those that he heals not to tell others. Of course, in most cases, they do just exactly the opposite. They can't contain themselves. They go and tell everybody what Jesus has done for them. Now, some scholars refer to this speaking by Jesus, forbidding the demons or those who have been cured or restored to tell others about him as Mark's messianic secret. I wouldn't classify it as a secret. I would say it is a truth that Jesus wanted to reveal at the right time, but this time was premature. That's my take anyway. So back to the reading. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And we'll see this continue as a pattern throughout Jesus' public ministry, that he will find some time apart, regularly, for prayer, perhaps even daily, likely daily, but sometimes special time apart, often a place by himself. And Simon and his companions hunted for him, and that is a very good translation, in my opinion. Other Bibles say that they looked for him, but the Greek is a compound word. It's katadixion, and it literally means to hunt something down. It could describe a hunter going after prey, or even a predator going after prey, or a lawman going after a fugitive. Simon, went out to hunt Jesus down, not to cause harm, but that sort of pursuit. Not only the disciples, but as we read, others were hunting or searching for Jesus too. And when they, Simon and his posse, found Jesus, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." And again, we ask, why? My guess is to put him back to work, right? So we see a parallel here with Simon's mother-in-law. she was bedridden, and then she gets up to minister, to serve others. Jesus is in prayer, possibly on his knees, and they tell him, hey, everybody's looking for you. Get up and start serving us again. Start curing again. Start healing again. But he answers them, let us go on to the neighboring towns so that I might proclaim the message there also. So I hinted to this earlier. Here is a different word than what Paul uses. It's the Greek charizo. It means to herald, to pronounce publicly, to preach. It's a common New Testament word. It appears in various forms about 60 times, along with another word. This is the word in our second lesson, a very specific word. It's euangeliozomai, and it means to preach the good news, specifically the gospel of Jesus. So Jesus uses this term, charizo, which is generically to proclaim or to herald. And Paul says of himself that he proclaims the good news of Jesus. So Peter says, let's go on to neighboring towns so that I might proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do. So Jesus could have stayed in Capernaum indefinitely. He could have kept on healing and casting out demons as long as people kept bringing the afflicted and possessed to him. And healing was a part of his ministry, but his primary calling, as he himself says here and in other places, is the proclaiming of the message, the gospel, the good news. And so he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons, again, to loop back to authoritative teaching and authoritative demonstrations of the divine power, like we talked about last week. Well, those are our lessons for this coming Sunday. Thanks for spending some time with me as we spent some time in God's Word. It's good to be back together with you again. I do encourage you to join us for worship this week and every week. And until then, God bless you and keep you. May we be doers of God's Word and not hearers only. Goodbye.